Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. Together? Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them from the face of all the earth. Amen. You may be seated. Yeah, so just to review a bit, more than anyone, Noah, his wife, their sons, and their wives knew of God's wrath because they've seen the flood. All right, so just a quick review. However, Ham and Japheth, they don't want to worship Noah's God. Ham and Japheth don't want to worship the God of Noah, their father's God. So the Bible is not clear why they chose to break away from the God of their father, but as we discussed before, some of it had to do with Noah's hypocrisy. On the one hand, he was praising God with his lips, but on the other hand, he wasn't living consistently with the things he was professing. And in the history of human beings, the psychology of the children is usually, if the parents are hypocrites, whatever the parents believe in, the children often don't want to participate in that. As we discussed before, Noah had this victim mentality. So this is an important point that we Christians have to remember is you can't say you put your trust in God on the one hand, and then say, "Woe is me, I'm such a victim," on the other hand, without being a hypocrite. These things have to be consistent, meaning if you believe that, if you put all your trust in God and you do believe that the God of the Bible is the living God, then there's no such thing as victim mentality, because we can overcome these things. However, if you stay in the woe is me mode, if you stay in the victim mentality mode, then there needs to be some self-reflection, because these are signs that we do not fully trust the Lord that we confess to be our God. But this is part of it. The other part of it is if you look at the history of the Bible, or history of the events in the Bible, there's a common theme for sinners, which is if sinners have a sin that they want to indulge in, God says no, and they don't want to hear that. So they become anti-worshipers of God. That's the other part of it. So every rebellion against God in the entire Bible history is based on that pattern, where a person or a group of people want to indulge in one or several sins. They want to indulge in it. But God doesn't allow that. So they say, well, I'm not going to worship God then. I'll worship whatever God I can that allows me to participate in this sin that I want to indulge in. And they become anti-worshiper of God. Or to put it another way, so we're going to put it in a different way here. Everyone who was an anti-worshiper of God is repeating the same sin pattern of Adam. Yo, Brother Tom, what are you talking about? Do you guys remember what the formula for Adam's sin was? I know this is like a long time ago we talked about it. Okay, so throughout history, rebellers of the triune God, so those that rebel against the triune God, try to convince themselves of lies. Otherwise, they'd have to confront the fact that God doesn't allow sin and I'm a sinner. So to not confront that fact, they convince themselves of lies so that they can say, this is not a bad thing. Why? Because I enjoy it. And here's one of the things that you can see. This is like the meta structure of like what's going on here. So God's view of power and responsibility is God first gives image bearers a responsibility. then God provides enough power and authority to accomplish that God-given responsibility. So God first gives the responsibility, then he gives the power. So if there's any power and authority, it's because there's a responsibility that's tied to it. And so you guys follow? So power doesn't come first. Responsibility comes first in the mind of God. There's a responsibility given, and the power and authority comes afterwards so that we can accomplish that responsibility. And God gives us more than enough. So power and authority is always subservient to responsibility. Power and authority is always subservient to responsibility, and God holds accountable every sinner who abuses that power and authority beyond what it was meant for. So on Judgment Day, God will demand an account for the responsibilities that God has given each of us on Judgment Day. So for instance, here's some of the things that God will hold us responsible for. Did we glorify God as God created us to do? Did we honor our father and our mother as God created us to do? Did we always do what is right and what's good in God's sight as he created us to do? These are some of the things that God, so there's more, but these are some of the things that God's going to hold us responsible for. He's going to hold us accountable for these things. And then God will determine and make it manifest to the sinner. He's going to make it known to the sinner and everyone else on that Judgment Day, whether or not we use the power and authority that God gave us to accomplish these things, or if we use those things for something beyond or other than those responsibilities. And he's going to say, if we happen to go past or move beyond these responsibilities, or we didn't use these power and authority for the accomplishment or the finishing or the fulfillment of these responsibilities, God will say to us, I gave you all these things to fulfill this responsibility. Why didn't you use these things to do that? The flip side of it, so on the other side of that is, so we have those, we're supposed to use these power and authority to accomplish responsibility. The flip side of that is, for those who did not use these things to accomplish their responsibility, but instead used it for something else, God's going to demand from us why we didn't use these things for responsibilities and instead used it for something else. And he's going to hold us accountable because these are things that God gave us, meaning it's his stuff that he's letting us be stewards over. Because we talked about the two kinds of giving, right? One is we're steward over it. One is God actually gave it to us so that it no longer belongs to God, but now it belongs to us. We talked about that, right? Okay. And there's a New Testament passage, a New Testament parable. I mean, there's more, but there's one example where Jesus actually addresses this in the form of a parable. In Matthew 25, verses 25 through 27. So this is the talent where there's 3 servants that a master had, and he gave one servant 5 talents, one servant 2 talents, and one servant 1 talent. The 5-talent servant made 5 more talents, the 2-talent servant made 2 more talents, and the 1-talent servant buried it in the ground. So here's what the master comes back, and here's what the master has to say. He says, he holds everybody accountable for the things that he's given them steward over, and then he's talking to the 1-talent person here. And the 1-talent person says, so I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground here. Hid it in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. Right? So just that one verse alone, you have my, I. Right? So that's the point here. These are the master's things. And the master's saying, why did you do what you wanted with my things? I gave you these things because they're mine, and I wanted you to be steward over these things. The point is that these things belong to the master, given to the stewards or the servants to be stewards over. And then the master held each servant accountable for how that servant used or abused these things. That's the point. So in our society, the anti-worshipers of God now, so those that rebel against God, trying to make, those who don't believe the God that we believe in, they turn this upside down so that power and authority comes first and then the responsibility to use it. So you have that famous Spider-Man movie that popularized the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility. Sounds great, but it's a lie. God first delegates a responsibility, then God gives more than enough power to accomplish that responsibility so that we have no excuse before God. Right? Because if we didn't have enough authority or power to accomplish it, we can say to God, God, you gave us this responsibility, but we didn't have enough power and authority. So in order that we have no excuse, God gave us more than enough power and responsibility. So the correct phrase actually is, God gives a power to accomplish a God-given responsibility. And to use that power beyond or apart from that God-given responsibility is power abuse. That's what that is. It's power abuse to use these power and authority beyond or apart from the responsibility God gave us. So there's no such thing as power without responsibility, because responsibility comes first. And power and authority is subservient to the responsibility. So, and there's Wikipedia articles that try to make it seem like the Bible teaches this, which is that, in other words, there's Wikipedia articles that says the Bible teaches that responsibility doesn't come first. That's the power thing that comes first. But if you actually read the passages that they're using to support that, it's the opposite of what they're saying. So going back to Adam then, Adam had a choice, and this is the formula for Adam's sin. Adam had a choice. His responsibility was to refrain from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was his responsibility. Why? Because that's the responsibility God gave to him. Does that make sense? So that's his responsibility. God gave Adam more than enough power and authority to accomplish that task. How? God gave him an original righteousness, an original holiness, and concreted original knowledge of God. God gave Adam all these things to affect and move his free will towards God and not towards himself. So he had all these tools, right? He had all these things that God gave to him to help him, more than enough, to help him accomplish this responsibility of not eating that fruit. So here's Adam's choice. Adam could either use that power that God gave him to refrain and restrain himself and therefore do what is right and what's good in God's sight, or Adam can use that power and authority to eat the fruit. So the responsibility is not to eat the fruit, but he has the power to eat it. So the question is, do you keep responsibility or do you abuse that power? That's the choice that Adam had. And as we all know, Adam abused that power, which is why we're where we are at today. But it's not only Adam's choice. That Adam's choice is actually given to every single person. Every time we make a choice concerning responsibility and power, the choice is always use the God-given power to only accomplish God's given responsibility, or to use that power, which is God-given, beyond that responsibility or apart from that responsibility. Every sinner after Adam is faced with this choice. And the sinner always chooses to abuse power. That's the history of sinners. Why? Because the will of the sinner is in bondage to sin, and therefore cannot do otherwise. They can't do anything else other than to obey the master that it's in bondage to, that it's a slave to. And this is why, without Jesus Christ, sinners can't do any good. God can suppress the sin so you can do a certain kind of good. But when God looks at that, on the last day, he's not going to say, oh, that was a good work that you did. He's not going to say that. He's going to say, this was a work that you did in sin. In bondage to sin, you committed this sin, or you committed this work. So, following the pattern of sin, Ham and Japheth had these sins they want to indulge in. So Ham and Japheth, they had these sins that they wanted to indulge in. And Noah's God, the God of their father, the God that they know caused the flood in order to judge sinners, so they know who this God is, that God says, Ham, Japheth, that's not allowed. You can't do that. So despite knowing who God is, Ham and Japheth reject this knowledge of God in their mind. And they live indulging in their sin, following the way of Cain. Because if you guys remember, Cain had a choice. He could stay within the presence of God and struggle with his sin, or he can leave the presence of God and indulge in his sin. And Cain chose the latter. Any questions or comments here so far? Okay. Cain. So there's Cain, who's the son of Adam. And then Canaan, C-A-N-A-A-N. Canaan, who's the son of Ham. And Cain, C-A-I-N, His choice was God's calling Cain to repentance, and Cain said, I don't want to because I enjoy the sin so much. So the Bible actually says he left the presence of God. And by leaving the presence of God, he doesn't have to then now he doesn't have to struggle with his sin anymore because he left God's presence. But that's the point. You don't want to leave God's presence. Yeah, you don't want to leave God's presence just so you can indulge in your sin. That's the anti-worshiper's attitude towards God. The proper attitude would be, God, I'm sorry. Help me to deal with this sin. And then struggle, but in the presence of God. Yeah, so any comments or questions concerning... Okay. So Noah, as their father, should be the one who should be able to persuade them otherwise, right? Noah being Ham and Japheth's father, he should be able to say, hey, you guys, I'm sorry that I was such a bad father, but, you can't leave God here, right? You have to go to God. You can't just be like, I'm not going to worship God because you have sins that you want to indulge in. But Noah can't do that. Why? Because he's living a hypocrite's life, right? Somebody who is like let's say somebody's a porn addict. You can't then come to somebody else who's also a porn addict and say, hey, you should be watching porn. Does that make sense? Because you're a hypocrite then. You can't. So let's say like you don't even go to church on Christmas or Easter, right? So you don't even go to those. And then you go, hey, you're a Christian. You need to go to church at least on Easter and Christmas. Like that doesn't make any sense because it's a hypocrite. So because Noah is living a hypocrite's life, he can't tell his sons, hey, you have to worship God. How do we know? How do we know Noah's living like a hypocrite? What happened to the burnt offerings? Do you guys remember the first thing Noah did as soon as he got off the ark? What's the first thing Noah did when he got off the ark? The first thing he did, you guys remember? Yeah, he offered burnt offerings to God. Why? For the sins of his family. So that God would, close his eyes for now until Jesus Christ comes for the sin of Noah and his family, right? That was the point. So he closed his eyes. But where's the burnt offering now in this Tower of Babel incident? Isn't Noah the high priest? Why isn't he doing his high priest things here? Because he can't. Because then he has to stop being a hypocrite, right? In order to consistently live as a priest of God. So this is a point that we can't get into because it'll take too long here. But the priests of God are not doing their priestly duties. That's why there's no mention of burnt offerings. Because the priests of God, Noah, Shem is a worshiper of God too, and he's the son of Noah, so he should be doing priestly duty as well. But there's no mention of priestly duties here because the priests of God are shirking off their duties because they're not living a consistent life with their confession of faith. And therefore not manifesting God's holiness in their lives and through their lives to the world and in their words. So if you read the entire Bible, anytime God's priests shirk off their duties or they're not doing their priestly things, idolatry rises exponentially. So anytime somebody's dedicated to be a priest of God, but they're not doing their work, they're not doing their priestly duties, idolatry rises exponentially in that community. So Noah is not domesticating the animals that he was supposed to. Right? God commanded Noah, hey, you need to domesticate these animals. You have to put the fear of man in them. Was the commandment that was given in Genesis 9:2, which God said, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps in the ground and all the fish of the sea. In your hand they are delivered. So Noah and his children are commanded to put the fear of man into the animals. How do you do that? Be their predator. I mean, you see deers, right? And then you see a tiger chasing after deers. What does the deer do? They run away in fear. That's the kind of fear we're talking about here. Noah's supposed to do that. Noah's supposed to make sure the animals understand like they're supposed to fear man because it's supposed to be a reflection about how man is supposed to fear God and therefore not do whatever man wants, not do whatever man feels like doing, but to fear God and say, okay, God is just. He's very holy. So there's a right, there's a wrong, there's a holy, there's an unholy. There's things that God approves and things that God doesn't approve. It's meant to reflect that. So Noah doesn't do that. Noah's sons doesn't do that. So if you guys remember, there's a guy named Nimrod that starts hunting these animals down, right? And then he goes, hey, I have all this power. I think I can become king. And he starts ruling over men instead of animals. Nimrod starts ruling over men instead of animals. So the families, right? So the families, because the animals are now overpopulated, and they're moving away from the ark. They're moving away towards east, and they settle in this place called Shinar. They settle in Shinar because Nimrod is able to hunt the animals to the point that his family and cousins now, because they're all brothers here, all speaking one language, they all moved from the ark towards Shinar because now there's no animals there. Why? Nimrod is killing all of them. So they settle in Shinar, and now they're like, oh, Nimrod becomes king, and he's like, there's nobody that can stop me from doing what I want to do. And then as sin exponentially increases because the priests are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, sin is exponentially increasing. And then Noah and Shem and those that worship God know that God's wrath is not something to shirk off, because especially Noah and his sons, they saw the wrath of God in the form of a flood. They saw that with their own eyes. So sin is exponentially increasing, and people are doing these weird things. And then Noah, Shem, they're both like, we're getting to that time again, like pre-flood conditions. And by the witnesses of Noah, Noah's wife, their sons, and then their wives, they're convinced that God's judgment is ready to be poured out again. That's what they're convinced of. Which is why they suddenly have this fear, like, there's going to be another flood. Even though God promised them, I'm not going to send another flood to judge all the earth again. So this is an instance where even the priests of God, they're taken by the spirit of the world. They're taken by the spirit of the age. And they believe that, or they follow that rather than following the word of God. And the word of God said, I'm not going to flood the world again. But they disregard that, and they start building this Tower of Babel. And any comments or questions so far? Okay, because now we're going to start talking a little bit more about what all this is about. So there's a parallel. We started this last week. There's a parallel between Genesis 6, which is the pre-flood condition, and then Genesis 11. There's a parallel there. So here's the, we saw this last week. And I color-coded it last week as well, just so you guys understand, like, how close the parallel is, actually. It's almost verse by verse. And it's just trying to point out the pre-flood conditions, or the same things that were happening in the pre-flood conditions were now happening in the post-flood condition. And the irony here is, during the pre-flood condition, Noah was the righteous one, right? Because he found favor in the sight of God. But here in the post-flood condition, Noah and his family are the ones now committing the same sin. So that's the irony here. And we talked about the colors last week, and I said this week we're going to go over the underlined stuff. Like, what is it about Babel? And if you guys remember from last week, I said, if you understand, you have to, so we're in the middle of a spiritual Babylon right now. But to understand spiritual Babylon, you have to understand physical Babylon, the nation. But then to understand the physical Babylon nation, you have to understand what happened at the Tower of Babel to understand what these are all about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So instead of turning to God, these people, right, instead of turning to God, they go, we're going to build a tower that God cannot submerge. And it's going to go all the way to heaven. It's going to go all the way to heaven. So even if he floods the earth, we won't be drowned. And of course, this is an impossible task. Because, and that's what we have to realize is, they know it's an impossible task, but they do it anyway because they're lying to themselves. Sinners, and this is the start of the Babel Tower, sinners make efforts to lie to themselves so that they can indulge in their sin without fear of God's judgment. That's what they're doing. They're trying to indulge in their sin, so they have to lie to themselves in order to do that. Because there's no, we're going to read this when we get to Psalms, there's no place where God doesn't exist. But they're trying to, and that means like there's no place where God's presence doesn't exist, or where God's holy presence doesn't exist. Temple presence is like a different issue, but yeah, so the fact that they think they can like outdo God's judgment or like escape God's judgment, they're crazy. But this is what sinners do. You know, they lie to themselves and they go, oh, you know, they think they have this like rule, and then a God plays by these rules. He doesn't. God plays by God's rules, not, you know, man-made rules. And again, the worst part here is pre-flood Noah stood against the evil of his generation. Post-flood, Noah and his children are the reason for this evil and the sin in his generation. Stefan will have to now... okay. So if you guys remember, I said there's a hint of like sexual misconduct in Genesis chapter 6. That's rape. It's not blatantly said, but the context is there. How do you know? Mighty men. What does it say? Came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them, right? It's not like they got married and they had children. It's like the mighty men, the men of war, just went in and they had children. So we're talking about rape here. And that's the parallel for Genesis 11. What's the parallel? The tower with its top to the heaven. So Shem is trying not to be like overt here, but he's just telling everybody the situation. And he's saying everybody's focused on this tower penetrating heaven, and then the seed of men going, you know, like overflowing into heaven. That's what he's like trying to show without being blatant about it. So I have some pictures here because this is going to be important when we get to the Israelites and the Canaanites, because, or not even the Canaanites. This is going to be important when we get to even the wilderness, even before they get to Canaan, because they worship a golden calf. And if you understood what happened here, you'll understand where the golden calf came from, which is from Egypt. But then where did the Egyptians get it from? And you probably won't remember this, but I said Egypt is actually, the proper name for Egypt is Mitzrayim. And that's actually a son of Cush, or son of Ham. So we'll talk about that. So prefatory note here. I'm not an expert in ancient Egyptian or Mesopotamian or Canaanite culture or Assyrian culture. Canaanite nor Assyrian culture. I'm not an expert. I'm just putting together what experts have said and showing you guys like, you know, like what the stuff they discovered, and then trying to just present information here. And I'm doing this so you guys can see why it's significant Israel makes the Egyptian golden calf in the middle of the wilderness, why Israel worships Baal on rooftops during the king's era, and why these idolatry practices reflect the spiritual Babylon religion that many Christians practice today in these last days, is why I want to show you this thing. So here's Hathor, the Egyptian goddess. Do you guys see that? That's Hathor. It's a sky goddess. I want you guys to recognize that she has horns. And her face doesn't look completely human. There's again, and then there's a circle. You see that circle on the horns? That's supposed to be a sun disk. It represents the sun. Because she's, well, we'll talk about that later, but yeah, we'll talk about that later. So she represents some sort of like a sky deity. But she's a goddess. So her gender is female. This is Moloch, or a depiction of Moloch in Rome. The Canaanite sun god. So the previous one was an Egyptian sun god, or Egyptian sky goddess. This is the Canaanite sun god, Moloch, a depiction of it. And there's no actual depiction or like an archaeological depiction or archaeological find of Moloch, because they've all been destroyed. And they've all been destroyed because God promised that their names are not even going to be remembered. So eventually we're not even going to know what the names of these Canaanite deities are going to be. So that's Moloch, or a depiction of it in Rome. And I just want you guys to notice the symbolism here. It's a sun, and then there's like an eye in front of it, or in the center of it. And it looks like, again, some sort of an animal, and it has horns. And it has 3 eyes, but that's something else. Here's Baal, or Baal Shamin. This is a deity, this is a male deity, a god originating from Mesopotamia. And he's a weather and lightning god. So he's related to the sky, something like affecting the sky god. My question is, are these 3 different deities, or are they the same deity expressed according to the different art language of each culture? So are they three separate deities that came out of three separate cultures, or is it one deity that's being expressed through three different cultures here? That's the question. So the first one was a sky goddess. The second was a sun god. This third one here is a weather or lightning god. They all deal with sky or heaven, influencing something in the sky. Right? They all deal with that as a deity. And this sky deity, or these sky deities, can be expressed both as male or female. Or in Baal's case, he has a consort who is a female, and they always go together. So Baal and Ashtoreth, I think, they're always shown together sometimes. And they always go together. They're not separated. And this gets into what the whole transgenderism about too. But we'll get to that later when we start getting to when Israel starts worshiping, because then we can start talking about what these deities were, and then why God told Israel that these are abominations to God. But for I just want you to understand, like, I'm putting out a well, we'll talk about that later. We'll get to it. Yeah, so that's another depiction of Baal. Again, you notice the head. It has horns. Okay, this is a close-up of the stele or stele of Baal inside the Galerie d'Angoulême of Louvre Museum in Paris, France. So this is the actual find. So they found this digging up stuff, and they found this like plate, rock plate, with a depiction of Baal, and he has that elongated head with horn. You see that? There's a reason why that head is elongated. It represents something. I'll just keep that in mind. And there's other symbolism too, like he has his hand up, right, as he's going to strike something. He has his hand up. We'll get to that later too. Not later today, but later sometime in the future. And we might not have enough time to go over all this, but so here's another one that they found. This is Assyrian soldiers of Ashurbanipal carrying a statue of Adad, also known as Ramim, the god of tempest and thunder, by Henry Foucher Gooden after Austin Henry Laird. And the source is History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 3. So this is another one, like a picture that they found in the archaeology or whatever it is, that they're trying to depict, this is supposed to be Baal. So the Baal is some sort of like a thunder deity or something. And a figurine. Oh, this is also another image of Baal Hadad, which is, you notice it looks like a cow too, right? It looks like a cow with horns, and then there's this thing in the middle, right? That's supposed to be the representation of the sun. Ah, there we go. So this is another figurine that they found through archaeology. The guy's hand raised, right? So this is the 3D representation of the first picture we saw of this. It's the 3D representation of this. But they found it at a different, a nearby but a different site. And this is the figurine of Baal, arms raised, horned helmet, and short loincloth. Place of discovery, Ras Shama, which is Ugarit. And sources in the Louvre Museum again. So that's what Baal looks like, okay, or depiction. And then here's what are some pictures that are, some people say these are unrelated pictures, but I want to show it to you first. So they say, okay, we know who Baal is. What's that? What's this called? Do you guys know? This thing over here and then this thing over here. Do you guys know what this is called? Obelisks. Obelisks. This is Washington, D.C. This is in Rome, Vatican Square, or St. Peter's Square in Vatican. So, United States, in the center of our capital, Washington, D.C., and then middle of Rome. It's an obelisk. And then there's this book describing the cult of these guys called the Rosicrucians, who are the predecessors to the Freemasons. You see that. Okay, so I'm not an expert, so I don't know exactly what they're talking about here, but they're just describing what they all symbolize. How do you get pyramids and then towers from like the same civilizations? And they're just basically saying they both represent these things. You have triangle, actually, I actually have the, here it is. We have asserted in an earlier, okay, I'll read this here. We have asserted in an earlier part of our book that the pyramidal or triangular form which fire assumes in its ascent to heaven was, in the monolithic typology, used to signify the great generative power. So all that means is these things that they're representing either by a pyramid or a pyramid-shaped thing, or this tower-looking thing that looks like a pyramid or like a condensed version of a pyramid, they represent fertility, generative power. That's what they represent. So pyramids and similar architecture is meant to express ascent into heaven. Does that sound familiar? Remember, this is Rosicrucian, so it's not Babel here we're talking about. We're talking about after Babel, way later, where these people are still practicing these things. And these tower-looking things that ascend into heaven, they have generative power. It's about fertility is what they're saying. This represents fertility. This thing that ascends into heaven represents fertility, is what they're saying. And then here, the adoration paid to this image of the phallus, which has persisted as an object of worship through all the ages, in all countries, was only the acknowledgement in the ancient mind of wonder at the seemingly accidental and unlikely, but certainly most complete and effectual, means by which the continuation of the human race is secured. So what they're saying is, these images that they set it up in order to secure the human race's genealogy. In other words, to make sure the human race doesn't die out, they purposely set up these obelisks and pyramid-shaped stuff wherever they go throughout the ages. In order to, well, how do you keep people alive? How do you keep people, producing more people? Well, you group them together, right? You keep them in one place, and you make sure they're constantly having kids. Does that sound familiar? So the Rosicrucians are saying, throughout the ages, the symbol of fertility, which is what that stuff, the symbol of fertility was expressed by the building of tower structures, ascending into heaven. And then that's how they used, that symbol is how they made sure people kept producing children and, keep progeniting. Okay, so then, remember, Rosicrucians are the forefront, or they're like the forerunners of the Freemasons. So the guy who founded Freemasonry, here's what he has to say. Hence the significance of the phallus, right here. Hence the significancy of the phallus, or of its inoffensive substitute, the obelisk. Right, so the obelisk is actually a substitute for the phallus. Rising as an emblem of resurrection by the tomb of the buried deity at Lerna, or it says. It's like French or something. Yeah, so it's an emblem of resurrection. It's an emblem of life after life. And you guys all know what emblem means, right? It's like a token of something. It's a sign of something. It's not the actual thing. They're saying it's a sign that points to that. Why? Because it's a fertility symbol. It's a fertility symbol. This obelisk is an inoffensive substitute for what's supposed to be a phallus, is what Albert Pike is saying. So Albert Pike, putting the order of Masons into written form, he's affirming the same things that the Rosicrucians have been saying. And according to the book of Mason and Occult Symbols illustrated by Dr. Kathy Burns, who was a former witch, the obelisk is not just any phallic symbol, but Baal's phallic symbol is what Dr. Kathy Burns says. That's what the obelisk is. But if you do any research about obelisks, you'll find that they're Egyptian in origin. Right? So what's Baal's phallic symbol doing in Egypt? Or rather, what's Egyptian originated obelisk doing in Baal cult worship? That's the question. And here it is. The monolithic obelisk was, and this is from omicawesley.edu. The monolithic obelisk was invented by the kings of the 5th dynasty, which is about 2024-65 BC, in reverence to the sun god Re, which is an Egyptian god. So the question is, okay, so you have an Egyptian, it's originated in Egypt to represent the sun, or like the firepower of their deity called Ra or Re. And that symbol is an obelisk, is a tower. And that tower somehow is representing Baal's phallus. Right? So are these separate deities, or are they all one deity being expressed in three different cultures? Right? So we're like, okay, it's a symbol of Re or Ra. What's that about? Well, where did Ra come from? Hathor was the ancient Egyptian deity. Hathor was the ancient Egyptian deity of many realms. Mother to Horus, the god of the sky, and Ra, the sun god. And the goddess of beauty, including cosmetics, sensuality, music, dancing, and maternity. She is often depicted wearing a headdress of a cow, horn with a sun disk between them, or as a cow or a lioness. So this is Hathor from the Brooklyn Museum. And what I want you guys to know is she looks like a cow. Just like Moloch. Just like Baal. And she has these horns. And she has the sun disk. Just like Baal, just like Moloch. This is from the Brooklyn Museum, so you guys can see this, you know. And then this one is from Egypt. Hathor from Shrine of Hathor in the Egypt Museum. And here's the cow. So here's their goddess here. And then she's like her headdress, the thing that she puts on her head is a cow's head, and then it has the horns here, and then the sun disk. Right? So it's a constant representation of like sky or sun power, even the moon. Later on, it gets to the moon power as well. But all three, we might say different civilizations that came up in different ages, all seem to have the same kind of deity when it comes to the sky. It's this horned thing with like a sun disk. And the gender doesn't seem to matter. It could be a woman, it could be a female or a male. And again, Moloch depiction. It's a cow. So what to get out of all this? Here's the things they all have in common, apart from their physical stuff. Here's the thing they have in common. They all require child sacrifice for fertility blessings. So these are fertility deities. In other words, the ancient cultures worship these deities in order to have like good crops, safety of their, communities or like their society. But to have these things, to have these blessings, they had to sacrifice children and infants and babies. So all three have those in common. So if you want a good crop season, you have to do baby sacrifice. They all require, and this is where Stefan, could you please put your earplugs back in? Okay. So they all require orgies of men. They actually require men to ejaculate to have any sort of effect here. So you have these temples dedicated to these orgies, whether it's all men or a mix between men and women. And what you don't have is an all women temple here, because it's the men's seed that they're trying to reflect from their Baal or Moloch deity, which is the life given by the seed. And we'll get more into these individual idols as they appear in the Bible. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they are all the same idol. It's the same deity, and it's expressed in different ways from the culture. Does that make sense? So if you believe in coincidences, like many, if you believe in coincidence like anti-worshippers of God. So if you believe in just coincidences, so these have really nothing in common. It's just a coincidence. If that's what you believe, then maybe really they just came out of nowhere. Like different civilizations just for some reason just had this idea that, hey, for some reason the sky looks like a fertility thing to me, and I need to offer child sacrifices to have like fertility blessings. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's what happened. Or if you don't believe in coincidences, maybe they're all part of the same civilization that split. And moreover, maybe it was Ham's sons who split. And maybe the sin that Ham wanted to indulge in was hedonism, especially sexual hedonism. Right? Then it makes sense. if we take the word of God to be the truth of God, or the truth, Ham, his religion is hedonism, particularly sexual hedonism, and his children learn this culture from him. But that's a very, hedonism goes against the order of God, the created order of God. It goes against that. Because God created us to restrain ourselves from these things, right? So then, okay, and you guys missed the first part about the responsibility, so I apologize if, you can go back and look at the sermon later. But God created us to follow his responsibilities, not our own desires. So it runs against God's order. There's disorder if you follow hedonism. So, and we're going to talk about this, the language splitting, which is next week. Once the language splits, they try to make sense of the disorder that they learned from their father. And they can't make sense of it. So what they're trying to formulate it into an organized religion to make sense out of it, because it's counter to God's organized religion. It's counter to that. In other words, if Ham was trying to indulge in hedonism, which I think all the sexual stuff coming out from only the sons of Ham shows us, it's not only Ham, but mostly Ham. And like I said, when we get to the Canaanites, there's a reason why God says, like, just destroy everything that they have. So when you see that's what's going on here, we can sort of like take a educated guess at what's going on here. Is Ham taught these guys something that's not making sense in their lives, and then once the language splits, they all have to figure out how to make sense of this disorder. And the way they do it is they try to put it back together in a form of organized religion. In other words, they're trying to put order into this disorder thing. And the formula that they formulate, the thing that they come up with to put order into these things, are these Baal worship, Moloch worship, Egyptian goddess worship, all these things, these practices, to make sense of what's going on in their heart. Because their father didn't want to, was not a worshiper of God, who would have made order for them, who would have taught them this is the way things are supposed to be. Does that make sense? Yeah, any questions or comments? We're way overdue now, so any questions or comments? Okay, if there's no questions or comments, we'll take offering, and then we'll pray, take offering, and then benediction.